Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 39, Episode 3, The Blame Game, Sources for the Battle of Agincourt. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. One of the first things to note about our surviving sources for the Battle of Agincourt, or Azincourt, fought on October 25th, 1415, is just how many of them there are. In a way, this is unsurprising, since it was and is one of the most celebrated and unexpected victories in English history. And yet, does this plethora of sources actually allow us to get any closer to what actually happened at the battle? As historians, we are blessed with a multitude of accounts from differing perspectives on the battle, from eyewitnesses on both sides, writers who were close to the participants of the battle, all the way through to later chroniclers and analysts. The sheer abundance of our sources for the battle leads to problems of their own, however, and ones we don't usually encounter when we rely on a single or only a few accounts for our information. Our sources contain contradictions, omissions, biases, and all sorts of entanglements based on contemporary religious perspectives, contemporary and later political agendas, as well as the influences of other interpersonal or factional conflicts, all of which need to be sorted out to understand the battle. That is, if such factors ever can be sorted or understood at more than 600 years remove. Some valuable sources have often been overlooked, or at least not utilised to their full potential, while other, perhaps less reliable accounts have, for various reasons, become the dominant versions of the battle. In subsequent historical analyses, not to mention the version provided by popular culture and myth which actually began soon after the battle, it is unsurprisingly a complex problem. Nonetheless, exploring our sources for this most famous of battles is worthwhile. One theme which runs through all of these sources, from the earliest to the most recent reconstruction, is who or what was to blame for the unexpected French defeat, and who or what should be given credit for the just as unexpected English victory. All of our sources play the blame game. The Battle of Agincourt is also unusual in that if a single source mentions something happening, it generally becomes incorporated into our modern account, even when that piece of information is unique and not independently corroborated. This tends to leave a sense of averaging our account of the battle rather than building a cohesive picture or making a picture where there remain elements which we are not sure how to incorporate into the rest of our account. One example is the commander of the English rear guard, Lord Camoys, who is only mentioned as the commander in a single source, the Gesler Henrici Quinti, whose author admittedly was stationed with the rear guard during the battle. Lord Camoys becomes unequivocally the commander of the rear guard, even though his command is mentioned nowhere else. We also get a combination of ideas from disparate sources on occasion. The idea that the ground on the battlefield was wet due to heavy rain and that the English were on uncultivated land whilst the French were on freshly ploughed soil also get added together, even though those ideas come from different sources. In one we have wet ground, but we are not told if it was ploughed or uncultivated. In the other we are not told whether the ground was ploughed or not, but we are told that it was notably wet, or even that there had been heavy rain. The combination of sources and information or tidbits may be correct, but they are often combined without noting that each comes from a different source. Even if an individual source is not usually considered independent or reliable, if it contains a unique piece of information, that piece then becomes available to be built into our averaged account of the battle. In some cases, such as for the deployment of the English forces and the precise numbers involved on each side, our sources can be wildly different and at odds with one another. Such disagreements add no knowledge, but only confuses the situation. In such cases, historians tend to rationalize the sources, more averaging, or choose a single account, normally what they regard as the most reliable. Most usually for the English it is the Gesta's 900 men-at-arms and 5,000 archers, chapter 9, although there are many more options. And so our account of the battle is a combination of, on the one hand, combining everything we know into a single account, and then picking, choosing, or rationalizing the information into a single account on the other. And that doesn't begin to incorporate anecdotal incidents reported for the battle and its participants. The situation there is even more complex. There are more sources than one could hope to cover in a brief introduction, but many of the sources are available, and books which incorporate and analyze them all. Anne Curry's The Battle of Agincourt, Sources and Interpretation, is indispensable. These sources have been published in all manner of locations over the last 2 centuries. In many cases of history, we are incredibly grateful for eyewitness reports. Men who were present at the events they describe provide unique insights into those events. Even with the biases and issues which exist with each and every source, their value as eyewitnesses usually overcomes such concerns. This is true of the eyewitness sources of Agincourt too, although there are seemingly more concerns than usual, and their reliability can possibly be called into question more than in other cases. We have 4 known eyewitness accounts of the Battle of Agincourt. The anonymous priest who wrote the Gesta Henrici Quinti, the Deeds of Henry V, the account of John Harding, who was present with Sir Robert Umfreville, that of Jean Warrin from Picardy, who was 15 at the time of the battle and probably served as a squire or page on the French side, and that of Jean Lefebvre, also from Picardy and 19 at the time of the battle. He was probably stationed with the heralds. Eyewitness accounts are normally written soon after the events they described, and often before other types of historical account. In the case of the Gesta, written around 1417, we have a case which conforms to this model. Our other eyewitnesses wrote much later in their lives, recalling the battle. The Gesta records, "I, who am now writing this, and was then sitting on a horse among the baggage of the rear of the battle." Gesta 12. The Gesta is our earliest source, generally considered the most reliable, and it understandably looms large in every modern account of the battle, even though it was not known in the 15th or 16th centuries and has several issues of its own. It may even have been official propaganda, although there is no real evidence of a royal commission for it. There have been several attempts to identify the author. Arguments favour either Thomas Elmham, who wrote another work, the Liber Metricius de Henrico Quinto, the metrical book of Henry V, in 1418, in which he tells us that the title was an abbreviation of an earlier lost work, or John Stevens, the canon of Exeter Cathedral. There is, however, no sure evidence, and the author must remain anonymous. Since he wrote so soon after the battle, and his seems to have been first written, his account is wholly independent and did not rely on any other written account as far as we can tell. In several cases it seems clear that the author had access to official documents, since his reporting of them is very close to the actual document when it survives for us to cross-check them, and he does seem to have taken notes during the campaign. He states in Chapter 12, "Things I noted, as said at the time," although he has much less direct speech than later accounts. He also includes few of the individual acts which would become so prominent in later accounts. These features have lent the Gesta more credibility. In some regards, though, the work confuses rather than clarifies. The author uses Latin terminology, which does not really help in our understanding of deployment. In regard to credit for the victory, the Gesta emphasizes the role of God's will. Chapter 14, "Rather let it be ascribed to God alone, from whom is every victory, lest the Lord be wrathful at our ingratitude, and at another time turn from us." The author does mention the showers of arrows, chapter 13, which forced the French back, but these too are the instruments of God's will, as is Henry, who is God's own soldier. The author also mentions stakes in passing. They are seized by the archers when their arrows were exhausted in chapter 13. They do not take the prominent place that they have in subsequent records and accounts. The French also are the victim of God's vengeance, chapter 13, whose thunderbolts struck the proud host of the enemy, and God turned away from them and broke their strength. This explanation is perhaps understandable from a religious source, as dissatisfying as it may be from a historical and military perspective. Such an explanation is also given by Thomas Elmham. For instance, the anger of God rose against the enemy so that the smaller army overcame the many thousand. He does also ascribe things such as the weight of the French armour wore them out, but also includes, "In the field St. George was seen fighting in the battle on the side of the English." Our other eyewitnesses, however, all wrote relatively late, Harding in the 1440s and 1450s, and Warren and Lefebvre in the 1460s. What is more, they used other written accounts, which had already appeared, to aid their accounts. They were also perhaps influenced by the burgeoning popular myths attached to the battle. It may also have been the case of their memories being affected by such myths over time. In the case of both Warren and Lefebvre, their accounts share exact passages with one another, and with another account, that of Agincourt de Montstrelet, his chronique presented to Philip the Good in 1447. There is no evidence that the earlier Montstrelet was an eyewitness, and so known eyewitnesses relying so heavily on an account written by a non-eyewitness is troublesome, to say the least. We might point out, however, that Montstrelet wrote nothing which either eyewitness felt was incorrect to include, which might give us more confidence in his account. John Harding's chronicle traces the history of Albion from foundation to his own times. This was a very popular genre at the time, and several of our sources for the Battle of Agincourt, such as the Brut, are of this type. Harding presented his work to Henry VII in 1457, and then again to Edward IV in 1464. The first version does not mention his presence at the battle, however. That only comes in the later account. What is more, that account version is derived largely from the anonymous Gesta. Harding was used a great deal by later historians, although his failing to mention he was present at the battle in the first version might raise doubts. He was there at all. Harding's account is actually quite slight, and he ascribes victory briefly to the grace of God's omnipotence. He also tells us that the English faced odds of greater than 10 to 1, 9,000 English against 100,000 French. For Englishmen 9,000 did not exceed that fought against 100,000 indeed. The accounts of Monstrelet, Warren, and Lefebvre are undoubtedly vital to our understanding of the battle. They are, in fact, the fullest accounts we have, but their relationship is entangled and complex, even though we know both Warren and Lefebvre were present at the battle. They wrote much later and used a great deal of Monstrelet's chronique, and are also identical to each other in their use of Monstrelet and each other, even when not following another source. There were also many other French sources written prior to their accounts. These three works are part of a chivalric chronicle trend in France during the reign of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. These chronicles recorded noteworthy chivalric deeds by men from both sides. As they represent the French eyewitnesses, however, and even though they had connections with the English, they also allow us to look at French explanations of the defeat. These are understandably more varied than the reasons given for the English victory. Indeed, one can almost detect as many reasons as possible for the French loss. One thing to note, however, is that by the time they wrote, the Battle of Agincourt had proved not to be at all decisive in the 100 Years' War, and so they are far less harsh in their judgments on the French than earlier accounts, which capture the sense that nothing worse had ever happened to the Kingdom of France. Lefebvre and Warren apportion blame to several factors: that the French had spent all night on horseback, it had rained, the ground was churned up so the horses could scarcely lift their hooves, and the French were so weighed down by their armour they could barely move. When the two sides came together, they could scarcely lift their arms. The non-use of the French archers is not explained as due to pride or folly, as other writers do, but as being on account of the narrowness of the field. They had plenty of archers and crossbowmen, but nobody wanted to let them fire. The reason for this was that the site was so narrow that there was only enough room for the men-at-arms. This same action is explained very differently by Edmond de Dinter's Chronique 127 as being due to the overconfidence of the French, for they put their archers, crossbowmen, and infantry in the rear, not wanting their aid, and intending in their great pride to defeat and capture the English king and all his men by dint of their swords and hand-to-hand fighting. These works, all pro-Burgundian in their stance, highlight another complicating aspect of our French sources. France was divided politically at the time between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, and depending on the leaning of the author, various events can be explained by that prejudice. In that way, pro-Burgundian sources can criticise the Armagnac house and also explain away the absence from the battle of Duke John the Fearless. The earliest surviving French source, the anonymous religieux monk of Saint-Denis, who wrote the Histoire de Charles VI, also seems to attempt to ascribe as many reasons as possible for the French defeat. Again, attempts have been made to identify the author, but none are certain. One of the main reasons he ascribes for the French defeat is pride. The French commanders were too proud to accept the 6,000 rude mechanics offered by Paris, and he speaks of the presumptuous talk of knights which had led to defeat in the past. Chapter 8 is entitled How the French were Defeated by the English. The author states that he will transmit for posterity the account of that sad day so that such faults can be avoided in the future. Reasons given here include overconfidence, following bad or least wise advice, and the ignoring of good advice from knights who were worth listening to because of their age and experience, the disdain shown for the small numbers of the English, ignorance, even traitors. The land on which they bivouacked was newly worked, and torrents of rain had flooded it and converted it into a quagmire. Fatigue and exhaustion, the sovereign arbiter of fortune. The dismissal of the crossbowmen is explained as pride, for they were not needed. The explanations for defeat continue with a lack of foresight, that the French were too restricted and weighed down by their weapons. They were too tightly packed, and the retreat of the vanguard caused a loss of morale. He even ascribes some blame to a new English terror weapon. Many of them had adopted a type of weapon until then unknown, great lead-covered mallets, from which one single blow on the head could kill a man. Other sources apportion credit and blame in a variety of ways. Thomas Walsingham's St. Albans Chronicle, written before 1422, writes of the muddiness of the place and the arrogance of the French, who held the English cheap, but also that they were burdened with their arms. Walsingham also uses classical references, which are common, along with biblical references in several sources. Henry is the warrior par excellence, offering an example in his own person to his men by his bravery in scattering the opposing battle lines with a battle-axe. Still, Henry ascribed the victory to God, as he ought. Tito Livio's Vita Henrici Quinti, written around 1438, and which was used by many subsequent writers, speaks of the French overconfidence. By far the most common reason given for victory across English sources is the will or grace of God, even when the role of the archers and other individuals is highlighted. French sources highlight the arrogance, pride, folly, and overconfidence of the knights, but also the role of rain and mud and fatigue, but also ill discipline, such as in the Memoires de Pierre Fenin. Some also refer to Henry's ascribing the victory to God, and that therefore the defeat was the result of French sins, and God wanting to punish those sins. There also seems to be a tendency in some French sources to only begrudgingly refer to the effectiveness of the English archers, and instead ascribe defeat to French factors, pride, folly, and sin, rather than English skill. It was a battle the French lost, rather than one the English won. Monstrelet, Warren, and Lefebvre, however, are clear in their accounts of the strength and effect of the English arrow fire, and write of it forcing the French back. They also mention that the French began to bow their heads because of the English arrow fire. Ursins, however, claims that our men had the sun in their eyes, so in order to better withstand and to reply to the English fire, they lowered their heads and inclined them towards the ground. Ursins also claims that the French were scarcely harmed by the arrow fire of the English, because they were well armed. Instead, he claims that the arrows only harmed the French horses, who the English archers deliberately targeted. The Religieux of Saint Denis refers to arrows as dense as a hailstorm, obscured the sky, and wounded a great number, and as a terrifying hail of arrows shot in chapter 8. The plethora of surviving sources for the Battle of Agincourt make fascinating reading in and of themselves, as examples of bias, genre, and any number of factors which go into the creation of a historical account. Together they can be welded to create a cohesive account of the battle, but the process of getting to that picture is just as fascinating as the battle they reveal. Thanks once again, Murray, for writing that episode for us. If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/The History Network. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Dahm, read by Nick Barker.